Welcome to our series on grief. In partnership with Gabby Jimenez of the Hospice Heart, we're featuring social workers Isabel Stencel and Lisa Pahl of the Death Deck in discussions on grief and grieving and how to manage it. You're listening to Heartbeat from the Heart of Hospice. I'm Jerry Finter, here with Helen Bauer.
Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, we're here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care. Because we know how busy life can get, Heartbeat is designed to give you helpful information in a bite-sized format.
So we are continuing our series today on grief with our colleagues Gabby Jimenez and Lisa Pahl and Isabel Stencel. And today we are talking with Lisa Pahl. And Lisa is a social worker in California who works in hospice as well as in the emergency room at a hospital. And so she has a lot of experience, and we're looking forward to hearing what she has to say. And she's also a grief specialist, so we're glad to have her here. And we're glad to have Gabby back. Welcome, Gabby.
Well, thank you so much. This is such an exciting project. I love that we're all doing this together, and thank you all for being here today.
Hi, Lisa. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's so nice to be connected again. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to let Gabby sort of facilitate this series, and she's going to lead the discussion, and we'll chip in when we have something to offer. We're very glad to have Lisa and Gabby with us today.
Lisa, thank you so much for being here, and I just look very forward to what you have to say. I think so many people are going to benefit from this. First, let's talk about holding on to grief for years. There are people who have just started navigating the process, but some of them have been holding on to it for years and years and years. What can you say to them? How can you support them to help them navigate this?
Well, when we talked about doing this series and that question came up, I first began thinking, what does that mean to be holding on to grief? Is it that perhaps it's natural grief that this person's experiencing? Because as a culture, we tend to think that grief is talked about like it's over quickly, or somehow in a year, people are supposed to have, quote, moved on. And so I guess first I just want to say that grief is kind of forever. I mean, when you love someone and you lose them, it doesn't go away. And I think that's kind of the most important aspect that we can kind of talk about, is normalizing the fact that grief is messy. Grief is much longer experience than typically we think about. So that's the first point that I want to make. And the second one is that grief is so unique for each person. Comparing grief from one person to the next is not helpful, first of all, but also it's impossible. There's so many factors that affect our grief, the type of support systems we have, the type of death it was, whether we were present or not. There's so many factors that make everyone's grief experience unique. So those are kind of the caveats. Like, let's not compare each other's grief, and let's understand that if someone is still grieving after 10 years, that's actually pretty normal. Now, the level of grief and how it's hindering our activities is something that maybe is helpful to talk about. And so when I think about someone really holding on to grief in a not very positive way, I think about somebody that is not really doing their activities that they used to enjoy, not that they're maybe isolating themselves, and they're not taking care of themselves, both physically, emotionally. They, might not be getting a haircut anymore, just letting themselves go, as, how people talk about. So that's something that I think is when we might want to offer more help when someone is exhibiting those types of symptoms or situations. I'm going to take a pause because I just talked for a long time.
Well, it was a really great segue, because I guess I think that we are programmed to help people who are recently experiencing a loss. How can we help someone who is experiencing something that is 10 years out? I mean, we can suggest a haircut, but is that appropriate? What can we say to them?
Oh, life is tricky like that, isn't it? There's no blanket thing to say, but I do think that offering to talk about the person that they've lost is a great way to support somebody, no matter if the loss is recent or 10 years in the past. Giving a person an opportunity to share memories and share stories, it helps the griever feel better. I mean, we all have lost somebody or something, and being able to share stories of that and talk about that for almost everybody really helps. The other thing is, especially for someone who might be isolating and not really getting out, is offering a visit, reaching out by phone, leaving a message, letting them know that you're there. Again, I would say across the span, that just letting someone know that you're there can help tremendously. Also, we can't fix the grief. And so, like you said, maybe we can offer to take them to get a haircut if they would like. And that might make them feel a little better, but we can't take away their loss. And so I myself, and I know you, Gabby, as a helper, we want to make people feel better. But one of the things that I've learned time and time again is that I can't take away the fact that they've lost somebody. And so I can sit with them, though. I can provide some human touch. I was visiting a friend that was at a facility, and there's all these COVID protocols, and we don't need to get into that, but I was able to briefly put my hand on his hand, and I watched his face, and it relaxed immediately. And I think we don't often think enough about human touch. That's another way that you can sit with someone. You can put your hand on their hand. You can offer a hug. If you're close enough, you can snuggle right up to them and just sit together. There aren't words that are going to miraculously make this better. The other thing is, there are a lot of grief support groups, and most don't have a timeline on how long ago your loss was. At the grief support groups that I've facilitated, we've had people, I should say, every place has their own structure and ideas about the grief support and how long ago the loss was. But we had people who would come who had lost someone 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and maybe a stress in their life has caused the grief to feel fresh again, or they finally kind of say, you know what, I think I want more support around this. So seeking out grief support groups years after the fact is a great idea for somebody that might need that extra support. And there are also, I know you know about Grief Coach. It's a tremendous resource for people who are a little more tech savvy, because you receive text messages of support. And my friend Lori and we signed up for that together. And I was her support person, and she got text as the griever. And her loss was at that time 8 years ago. And she found that to be very helpful. And it gave me a lot of great ideas too. So those are a couple resources that might be helpful for listeners.
You gave me a really good thought. I think that what we have to remember is to not stop checking in, and the grief coach is a great idea, but we can do some of that too, simply by sending a text message, just, I'm thinking about you, and to continue holding space for them, because like you said, sometimes, you go on with your life and a song could play or someone could pop back into your life for a moment, and all of that is rekindled and making it fresh again. So that's a perfect reason why we should continue just to check in.
in hospice, we will be there to support the family following the patient's death for a year, which is great. That's good. But that's really not enough because, as you've already pointed out, the grief continues on for, well, a lifetime. Let's just be honest. The grief really never does end. But there are people who get stuck in their grief, and they're at a point where they just can't seem to get past that. In fact, it becomes almost their identity. Their identity becomes that of a griever, and they look at themselves that way, and everybody around them looks at them that way. How do we get those people? How do we care for those people? Let me put it this way. How do we care for those people who seem to be stuck in their grief?
Well, that's a really good question. And you could hear the heavy sigh because that's a hard one. I think sometimes therapy is appropriate. Seeking out professional help can be really, really helpful and important for people, kind of going back to this idea of someone who's not really functioning or not really, and I guess you're kind of saying maybe not quite to that level of
Right.
not functioning, but rather this is their identity and this is it's all consuming kind of. So aside from maybe gently talking to them if they're willing to talk to a grief professional, that's one option. The other is, once we've already provided space for them, once we've allowed them to share stories and really sit with them in that grief, I think then we can do some gentle attempts at helping them reconnect with some past things that they found joy in. I've had, family members of patients who they used to read novels, and then when they were caring for their loved one, they couldn't focus on the pages anymore. And and so trying to help that person recognize the things that used to be helpful. That used to be helpful coping strategies, but also used to be things that they enjoyed.
Right.
Trying to encourage them to get back to some of these social connections with people and potentially outside of grief connections. And it's helping people take very small steps, to move themselves out of that space. And it is a delicate balance, and every person is going to respond differently. And so you test the waters and you make some suggestions if the person seems receptive to it, I think.
Sure.
But again, we can do all of these things as much as we're able, but it is going to be on that person, whether they're able, willing, capable at that time. So it's important for those of us that care about somebody to also kind of recognize our own limits with that and not carry the responsibility of their grief on our shoulders.
This reminds me a little bit of David Kessler's work. He has his book that came out last year. Is it Finding Meaning? I think, which he says is the 6th stage of grief. It's really just an additional layer on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. And he talks about with the death of his son, how he was able to find meaning and how that kind of grief work was very helpful. And I wonder if maybe that's something that we can do to help people who are grieving like this, to help them find activities that are meaningful to them.
That is a great idea. And thank you for bringing that up. I think finding meaning and finding usefulness, a lot of times people will tell me, especially older adults that are retired and potentially lost their spouse, no one is needing them anymore. And so that feeling is, it's a sad feeling. And so some people, we talked earlier before we started recording about all of our love of pets. And I am a fan of people getting a pet, to be honest, as someone that they can care for, that needs them. I don't know if you all watched the show Afterlife. Ricky Gervais's beautiful, funny, a little bit of dark humor, and he's grieving his wife. And I think the 3rd season just came out. They deal with grief beautifully in this series, but he has a dog, and so the dog is really what got him up every day, because the dog needed to get out and the dog needed to be fed. And so that's another idea as a way to maybe suggest to someone who's needing to find purpose and usefulness.
Right. Yeah, it provides companionship as well, which is something that many people find helpful.
Wow. Thank you so much, Lisa. I think one of my biggest takeaways as just somebody who, of course, I know so many people who have lost someone recently and years ago. And I think that's going to be my motivation, is to reach out to them and just, I think, remind them that they matter, help them to find some sort of purpose or to rekindle some sense of joy within. And so this has been really good food for thought. I really appreciate what you had to say today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Gabby. And one last note to kind of leave on is, being someone that's willing to talk about grief and willing to listen about grief and death and loss is the most helpful thing you can do for anyone, is just being a person that's willing to have those conversations, because not everyone is, and not everyone is able to. Just by being that person, you are helping a lot.
Absolutely. This has been a good conversation. This is really something we need to consider because, as we've already said, grief does not end. The feelings of grief may change. There'll be highs and lows when it comes to those feelings, those emotions of grief. But the grief really is not going to end because, as I think David Kessler puts it, how long did you love that person? Well, that's how long the grief will last, and our love with them, our love for them will continue on. And so will the grief too, because we're still going to miss them. So we need, as people who are caring about others, to think about how to care for people, even if their grief is over something that happened 10, 20, even 30 years ago. That doesn't mean that they've stopped grieving. So reach out, help those people. So Gabby and Lisa, thank you so much for being on the Heart of Hospice podcast today and helping us with this Heartbeat series on grief. We're glad to have you here. Helen, you've been listening for this very quietly today. Do you want to add anything in to the conversation?
How unusual of me, right? I would just remind our listeners that you can connect with Gabby Jimenez at thehospiceheart.net, and you can connect with Lisa Pahl at thedeathdeck.com. Is that right?
I think that's right.
Oh, awesome. We love connecting with you guys. It's been too long.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Heartbeat from the Heart of Hospice. I'm Jerry Finter here with Helen Bauer. Because we know your hospice journey is 24/7, you can always find us at theheartofhospice.com. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening and leave a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts.
To connect with us, you can send an email to host@theheartofhospice.com. You can also find us on social media. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.